The sun was a merciless god, hammering the cracked earth of Jedediah's ranch into a mosaic of baked clay and dust. It had been 112 days since the last meaningful rain, 112 days of watching his world parch, wither, and die. The wind, when it blew, offered no relief. It was the hot breath of a fevered giant, stealing what little moisture remained and carrying the scent of his own failure across the barren plains. The creek, once a silver ribbon that stitched his land together, was now just a gravelly scar, its smooth stones lying bleached and naked under the relentless glare. His cattle, once a herd of 50 strong, had dwindled to nothing. Some he'd sold for a pittance to buy flour and beans. Others had simply laid down in the dust and surrendered their ghosts to the shimmering heat. The last one, a tough old bull named Absalom, had wandered off 3 weeks ago, likely in a delirious search for water, and never returned. Jedediah hadn't even had the strength to look for him. His home was a reflection of his land. The log cabin, built with his own 2 hands and the boundless optimism of a younger man, now sagged like a weary shoulder. The chinking had crumbled away in places, allowing the dust and the despair to seep in. Inside, it was a hollow shell of a life that once was. The rocking chair Mary had loved so much sat still and silent by the cold hearth, a thin veil of dust covering the worn oak. It had been 6 months since the fever took her, swift and cruel, leaving him in a silence more profound than any drought. Her laughter had been the rain that nourished his soul, and without it, he was turning to dust, just like his land. The small vegetable garden she had tended with such care was now a graveyard of brittle stalks and sun-scorched leaves. He'd tried to keep it watered, hauling buckets from the nearly dry well until his back screamed and his hands bled. But it was a losing battle. The earth was too thirsty. It drank all he could give and demanded more. Today was a day of reckonings. His supplies had dwindled to a single, solitary loaf of bread. It sat on the rough-hewn table, a small, dense lump made from the last of his flour. It was dry and hard, but it was all he had. He'd planned to make it last 2 days, but the gnawing emptiness in his belly was a relentless beast. He stared at it, his reflection warped in the tarnished silver of Mary's hand mirror hanging on the wall. He saw a stranger looking back, a man with eyes sunk deep into a gaunt face, a beard threaded with gray that was more dust than hair, and skin stretched taut over bones that seemed too sharp for his frame. This wasn't the strong, hopeful man who had brought his bride to this valley. This was a ghost, haunted by the specters of what he'd lost. He was 40 years old but felt 100. The West had a way of doing that, of carving years into a man's face with a knife of hardship. He picked up the loaf. It felt heavy, like a stone. He could eat half now, save the rest for morning. Or he could eat it all, feel full for one brief, glorious moment, before the hunger returned with a vengeance. What was the point of prolonging it? When the bread was gone, what then? There was nothing left to sell, nothing to barter. His neighbors, the nearest a day's ride away, were facing their own struggles. Charity was a luxury no one could afford. He broke the loaf in 2, the sound unnaturally loud in the suffocating silence. A few dry crumbs scattered across the table. He picked them up, one by one, and placed them on his tongue, savoring the faint, dusty taste of wheat. He was about to lift one of the halves to his mouth when a flicker of movement outside the grimy window caught his eye. He froze, every nerve ending tingling with an alarm that had been honed by years on the frontier. He was not a man given to flights of fancy. The emptiness of the plains was absolute. Anything that moved was either a threat or a meal, and he was in no position to hunt. He moved slowly, his worn leather boots making no sound on the plank floor. Peeking through the edge of the window, he scanned the landscape. The sun was beginning its slow descent, painting the western sky in brutal strokes of orange and crimson. The world was cast in a long, distorted shadow. And there, by the edge of the dead creek, was a small figure. It was a boy. Jedediah's heart hammered against his ribs. He was too far to make out details, but the boy was small, maybe 10 or 12 years old, and he was crawling, not playing, but crawling with a desperate, wounded slowness that spoke of immense pain. Jedediah's first instinct was caution. This was Apache territory. Though the local tribe had kept to the high country for years, tensions with settlers were a constant, simmering pot, always threatening to boil over. A lone boy could be bait, a trap. His hand instinctively went to the Winchester rifle propped against the wall. It was clean, oiled, and ready, a habit so ingrained it was like breathing. He watched for a long moment, his finger resting on the cold steel of the trigger guard. He scanned the ridges, the rocky outcrops, the sparse, skeletal remains of the cottonwood trees. He saw nothing, no sign of an ambush, no dust clouds from approaching horses, just the boy, struggling, a small, dark speck against the vast, indifferent landscape. Then the boy collapsed. He didn't just lie down. He fell, his small body surrendering to gravity in a way that signaled the end of all strength. And in that moment, the hard shell around Jedediah's heart cracked. He didn't see an Apache. He didn't see a threat or a trap. He saw a child, alone and broken at the edge of his dead world. He saw a vulnerability that mirrored his own. Mary's voice echoed in his memory, a gentle whisper from a better time. Kindness costs nothing. Jed, it's the one currency we can always afford to spend. But it wasn't true. Kindness could cost everything. It could cost him his life. Yet, what life did he have left to protect? A life of dust and silence and the slow, grinding agony of starvation? He let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. He left the rifle where it was. He picked up the two halves of his last loaf of bread, wrapped them carefully in a piece of clean sackcloth, and tucked them into his shirt. He grabbed his water skin, which held the last of the brackish, metallic-tasting water from the bottom of his well, and slung it over his shoulder. He opened the cabin door, the hinges groaning in protest, and stepped out into the furnace of the dying day. The heat hit him like a physical blow. With each step he took towards the creek bed, the dust rose in soft puffs around his boots, as if he were walking on ashes. He kept his hands visible, his pace steady and unthreatening. He didn't know if he was walking towards his own death or a moment of redemption. In the stark, silent emptiness of his life, he wasn't entirely sure there was a difference. He just knew he had to walk. The small, still form by the creek pulled at him, a tiny anchor of purpose in his vast sea of despair. As Jedediah drew closer, the details of the scene sharpened with brutal clarity. The boy was lying face down, his small frame looking impossibly fragile against the hard, unforgiving ground. He wore buckskin leggings and a breechcloth, both scuffed and torn. His bare back was slick with sweat and streaked with dirt, the muscles beneath the skin standing out like fine wires. Long, black hair, matted with dust and what looked like dried blood, spilled across the gravel. Jedediah's steps slowed as he approached, his boots crunching on the loose stones of the creek bed. He made enough noise to announce his presence, not wanting to startle the child, if he was even conscious. He stopped a few feet away, his shadow falling over the boy. There was no response. For a terrible moment, Jedediah thought he was too late, that he had walked all this way to witness the finality of death. He knelt, the joints in his knees cracking like dry twigs. "Easy now, son," he said, his voice a rough, unused croak. He gently placed a hand on the boy's shoulder. The skin was hot, feverish, but there was a faint, shuddering intake of breath. He was alive. With immense care, Jedediah rolled the boy over. The child's face was sharp and angular, his skin the color of burnished copper, now pale and ashen beneath the dirt. His eyes were closed, his lips cracked and swollen. A deep, ugly gash ran down his left calf, from just below the knee to the ankle. It was inflamed and angry, the edges crusted with dried blood and dirt, the source of the trail Jedediah had seen. It was a wound from a fall perhaps, or a glancing blow from an animal. Whatever the cause, it was badly infected. The leg was swollen to nearly twice its normal size. Jedediah uncorked his water skin. He wet a corner of his bandana and gently began to clean the boy's face. He wiped away the grime from his forehead, his cheeks, his lips. The boy's eyelids fluttered. Dark, fathomless eyes opened, clouded with pain and disorientation. For a heartbeat, they widened in sheer panic as they focused on Jedediah's weathered white face. A small, guttural sound escaped the boy's throat, and he tried to push himself away, his movements weak and uncoordinated. "Whoa, whoa, easy there," Jedediah soothed, holding his hands up in a gesture of peace. "I'm not going to hurt you, just here to help." The boy stared at him, his gaze sharp and intelligent despite the fever, a wild animal cornered and afraid. He didn't understand the words, but the gentle tone seemed to register. His struggling subsided, replaced by a tense, wary stillness. Jedediah knew he couldn't treat the wound here, out in the open. Infection was a death sentence in this heat. He had to get the boy back to the cabin. "All right, little one, we're going for a little ride," he murmured, more to himself than to the child. He knew what he had to do would be painful. He positioned himself carefully, sliding one arm under the boy's shoulders and the other under his knees. With a grunt of effort that spoke of his own weakened state, he lifted the child. The boy was light, frighteningly so, like a bundle of dry sticks, but he was still a dead weight for a man running on fumes. As Jedediah straightened up, the boy cried out, a sharp, piercing sound of agony as his injured leg was jostled. He went rigid in Jedediah's arms, but he didn't fight. He buried his face in Jedediah's dusty shirt, his small body trembling with waves of pain. The walk back to the cabin was one of the longest of Jedediah's life. The setting sun cast their conjoined shadow long and skeletal before them. Each step was a monumental effort. The muscles in his back and arms screamed in protest. Sweat poured down his face, stinging his eyes. The boy in his arms was a furnace, radiating a dangerous heat. Jedediah focused on the cabin door, making it his only goal. He didn't think about the Apache warriors who might be searching for their lost child. He didn't think about his own gnawing hunger. He just thought about the next step, and the one after that. He could feel the boy's shallow breaths against his chest, a fragile rhythm that he was determined to protect. Inside the cabin, the air was still and thick, but it was a relief from the direct heat of the sun. He gently laid the boy on his own cot, the only soft surface in the house. The straw-stuffed mattress rustled as it took the small weight. The boy's eyes were closed again, his face a mask of pain. Jedediah moved with a quiet urgency. He stoked the embers in the hearth, adding a few precious pieces of wood until a small fire was going. He put a kettle of water on to boil, the last of the clean water from his barrel. While it heated, he rummaged through a small wooden chest where Mary had kept her remedies. He found a tin of salve made from pine tar and herbs, and clean strips of linen she had torn from old shirts. He found a bottle of whiskey, nearly full. He rarely drank, but he knew its value as a disinfectant. Returning to the cot, he looked down at the boy's leg. It was worse than he'd thought. Angry red streaks were beginning to travel up from the wound, a sure sign the poison was spreading. He knew he had to clean it, and clean it well. It was going to hurt. He poured a little water into a bowl to cool and knelt beside the cot. "All right, son," he whispered, knowing the boy couldn't understand. "This part is going to be rough. You got to be strong for me." He took a clean rag, soaked it in the warm water, and began to gently wash the area around the gash. The boy flinched, his body tensing, but he didn't cry out. He just clenched his jaw, and a single tear escaped from the corner of his eye, tracing a clean path through the dust on his temple. Jedediah's heart ached at the sight, such bravery in one so small. When the area was clean, he took a deep breath. This was the hard part. He uncorked the whiskey, the sharp smell filling the small room. "Hold on tight," he warned. He poured the alcohol directly into the wound. The boy screamed. It was a raw, unfiltered sound of pure agony that tore through the silence of the cabin and seemed to shake the very walls. He arched his back, his hands clawing at the mattress. Jedediah put a firm, steady hand on his chest, holding him down. I know, he grunted, his own eyes watering from the boy's pain. "It's to burn the sickness out." He poured more, flushing the dirt and gravel from the wound until it was as clean as he could get it. The boy's screams subsided into ragged, gasping sobs. He was trembling violently, his body slick with a feverish sweat. Jedediah worked quickly then, his hands surprisingly gentle. He coated the wound and the surrounding skin with a thick layer of Mary's dark, pungent salve. Then he took the clean linen strips and expertly wrapped the leg, starting from the ankle and working his way up, making the bandage firm, but not tight. When he was done, he pulled a thin blanket over the boy. The child's eyes were open again, looking at him. The fear was still there, but now it was mixed with something else. A dawning, exhausted confusion. The pain in his leg had subsided to a dull, throbbing ache, a vast improvement from the searing fire of moments before. Jedediah stood up, his own body aching with sympathy and exhaustion. His gaze fell upon the table, where the sackcloth bundle lay. His hunger, forgotten in the urgency of the moment, returned with a vicious, hollow pang. His stomach growled, a low, desperate sound. He walked over to the table and unwrapped the bread. The two halves sat there, his entire fortune. The boy on the cot watched his every move, his dark eyes following the bread. He licked his cracked lips. In that moment, there was no choice. It wasn't even a decision. Jedediah walked back to the cot, holding one of the halves of the bread. He broke off a small piece, about the size of his thumb, and held it out. "Here," he said softly. The boy stared at the bread, then at Jedediah's face, as if he couldn't comprehend the gesture. Jedediah pushed it gently towards the boy's lips. Tentatively, the boy opened his mouth and took the offering. He chewed slowly, deliberately, his eyes never leaving Jedediah's. Jedediah broke off another piece and ate it himself, showing the boy it was safe. He then handed the entire half-loaf to the child. The boy took it in his small, trembling hands and held it as if it were a precious jewel. He took another small bite, then another, eating with a slowness that spoke of both starvation and pain. Jedediah sat on the floor by the cot, his back against the wall, and ate his own half. They ate in silence, the only sounds the soft chewing and the crackle of the fire. The shared meal, this last communion of the starving, forged a bond in the quiet cabin, a fragile truce between two worlds under the watchful eyes of the encroaching night. Jedediah didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but for the first time in a long time, he felt he had done something that mattered. He had shared his last crust, and in the profound quiet that followed, it felt like enough. The fire dwindled to a soft orange glow, its embers pulsing like a sleeping heart in the darkness of the cabin. Jedediah didn't return to his own bed, which felt wrong to even consider. Instead, he remained on the hard floor, his back propped against the rough-hewn logs of the wall, the empty Winchester lying across his lap. He'd dozed off in fits and starts, his sleep shallow and haunted by half-formed dreams of stampeding cattle and Mary's fading smile. Each time he awoke, his first glance was towards the cot. The boy, whose name he didn't know, was sleeping, but his rest was fitful. He would murmur in a language Jedediah didn't understand, his small body twitching. Twice Jedediah rose to press a cool, damp cloth to the boy's forehead, trying to will the fever down through his gentle touch. The heat radiating from the child was still intense, a dry, dangerous fire that seemed to be consuming him from within. As the first hint of dawn began to seep through the cracks in the walls, painting the dusty air in pale shades of gray, Jedediah felt a change in the room. The boy's breathing had evened out. His tossing and turning had ceased. Jedediah pushed himself to his feet, his joints protesting with a chorus of creaks and groans, and moved to the side of the cot. He placed a hand on the boy's forehead. The skin was still warm, but the raging furnace had subsided. The fever had broken. A wave of profound relief washed over Jedediah, so potent it almost buckled his knees. He had done it. He had pulled the boy back from the brink. The child's face, in the soft morning light, seemed more peaceful than it had any right to be, the harsh lines of pain softened by sleep. The remaining half of the bread lay on the blanket beside him, clutched loosely in his hand. He had eaten only a small portion of it. Exhaustion settled deep into Jedediah's bones. The gnawing hunger in his belly was a dull, constant ache now, a familiar companion. He looked around the cabin, at the empty shelves, the cold hearth, the silent rocking chair. The brief sense of purpose he'd felt the night before began to evaporate with the morning mist, leaving behind the stark reality of his situation. The boy was better, yes, but what now? He couldn't keep him. The boy had a family, a tribe, people who were surely searching for him. And when they found him here, in a white man's cabin, what would they think? Would they see an act of mercy, or a kidnapping? The space between the two could be as thin as a razor's edge out here. And what could he offer the boy anyway? He had no more food, and the well was nearly dry. He was a sinking ship, and he'd just pulled another soul aboard. With a heavy sigh, Jedediah turned and opened the cabin door to face the new day. He expected the same brutal, unchanging vista, the pale, cloudless sky, the scorched earth, the shimmering heat already beginning to rise. He stepped outside, his eyes squinting against the nascent light, and a deep, primal stillness seemed to fall over the world. The air was unnaturally quiet. No birdsong, no buzz of insects, not even the whisper of the wind. It was a weighted silence, thick with anticipation. He took a few steps away from the cabin, his gaze sweeping the horizon out of habit, and that's when he saw it. He blinked, certain his mind, addled by hunger and lack of sleep, was playing tricks on him. The boy was gone. He spun around and looked back at the cot, visible through the open door. The blanket was folded neatly, and the piece of bread was gone. Panic, cold and sharp, lanced through Jedediah. How? He had been by the door all night. The floorboards creaked. He would have heard him leave. The boy had moved with the silence of a ghost. Jedediah's heart sank. He felt a pang of loss that surprised him with its intensity, followed by a surge of cold fear. The boy was still weak. His leg was injured. He wouldn't get far on his own. But more than that, a lone Apache boy, having just left a white man's ranch, was a dangerous loose end. His eyes frantically scanned the plains again, searching for a small, struggling figure. He saw nothing near the creek bed, nothing by the collapsed fence line. He looked towards the eastern ridges, where the sun was now cresting, spilling liquid gold across the landscape and throwing the world into sharp relief. At first it was just a dark line against the brilliant glow, a disturbance on the rim of the world. He thought it might be a herd of pronghorn or wild mustangs, but the line was too orderly, too uniform. It had a rhythm to it, a purpose. As the sun climbed higher, the light caught glints of metal, and the dark shapes resolved themselves. They were riders, not one or two, but a column so long it seemed to stretch across the entire ridge. They were descending into his valley, moving with a slow, deliberate pace that was far more menacing than any charge. Jedediah's blood ran cold. He could make them out now. The feathers in their hair, the lances held upright, the glint of rifle barrels catching the morning sun. Apache. It had to be hundreds of them. His mind raced. They had found the boy, or the boy had found them, and now they were coming for him. This was it. The trap he had feared was sprung. The act of kindness had been a death sentence after all. His hand instinctively flew to his hip for a pistol that wasn't there. His rifle was inside, a useless piece of wood and steel against such a force. He was a dead man. There would be no questions, no trial, just a swift, brutal end. He thought of running, of trying to hide in the rocky outcrops to the west, but it was hopeless. Their horses would run him down in minutes. He was trapped in the center of his barren, dead land, with nowhere to go. He stood frozen, a solitary figure in the vast empty space between his cabin and the approaching army. He could hear them now, a low, rumbling sound that was not quite thunder, the muffled beat of hundreds of hooves on the hard-packed earth. It was a sound that vibrated up through the soles of his boots and into his very bones. The sound of an approaching earthquake, the sound of fate. The riders fanned out as they reached the valley floor, forming a wide, silent crescent that began to encircle his small homestead. They moved with a terrifying fluid grace, their ponies seeming to float over the cracked ground. They were a river of men and horses, flowing inexorably towards him. Jedediah didn't run. He didn't shout. He simply stood his ground, his heart a wild drum against his ribs. He thought of Mary, of her gentle face, and hoped he would see her soon. He lifted his chin, determined to meet his end, not as a coward, but as a man, standing on the land he had poured his life into. The silent, formidable line of warriors drew closer, their painted faces grim and unreadable, until the lead rider was less than 100 yards away. And there, riding beside the formidable chief, at the very head of the column, was the boy. He was sitting astride a pinto pony, his bandaged leg clearly visible, and in his hand, held out as if it were a sacred offering, was a half-eaten crust of bread. The world seemed to hold its breath. The only sound was the soft creak of leather and the snorting of horses as the immense crescent of Apache warriors pulled to a halt, forming a living wall around Jedediah and his small, vulnerable cabin. They sat on their ponies in absolute silence, their dark eyes fixed on him, their faces stoic and impossible to read. They were a force of nature, an embodiment of the harsh, untamable spirit of the land itself. Jedediah stood alone in the center of their attention, his own breath caught in his throat. He felt as small and insignificant as a single blade of grass before a prairie fire. He could see the intricate beadwork on their moccasins, the eagle feathers tied in their hair, the hardened steel tips of their lances. Each man was a study in lethal efficiency, and there were hundreds of them. His gaze locked onto the boy, who looked back at him with an expression of solemn intensity. The warrior beside the boy was clearly the leader. He was a man who seemed carved from the rock of the mountains themselves, broad-shouldered and imposing even while seated on his war pony. His face was a mask of stern authority, lined with the wisdom of years and the hardness of countless battles. A magnificent headdress of eagle feathers flowed down his back, and a necklace of bear claws rested on his powerful chest. He dismounted with a fluid grace that belied his size, his moccasins making no sound on the dusty ground. The boy slid off his own pony and limped to the chief's side, his hand clutching his father's arm for support. The chief placed a steadying hand on his son's shoulder, his eyes never leaving Jedediah. Jedediah braced himself. He expected the chief to produce a weapon, to give a signal that would send a volley of arrows or bullets tearing into him. His life was hanging by the thinnest of threads, and the chief held the shears. Instead of a weapon, the chief reached out his hand towards his son. The boy, in turn, carefully placed the half-eaten crust of bread into the chief's open palm. The chief closed his hand around the stale bread, as if it were the most precious object in the world. He then began to walk forward, alone, his steps measured and deliberate. The boy remained behind, watching, his small form a focal point in the vast tableau of armed men. The chief stopped a mere 10 feet from Jedediah. He was taller than Jedediah, and his presence was immense, radiating a power that was both ancient and immediate. He looked at Jedediah's gaunt face, his threadbare clothes, his calloused and empty hands. His gaze swept over the dilapidated cabin, the withered garden, the bone-dry creek bed. His eyes, dark and piercing, seemed to see everything, to understand the full measure of Jedediah's poverty and despair in a single, all-encompassing glance. Then, he spoke. His voice was deep and resonant, a rumble that seemed to come from the earth itself. The words were in the Apache tongue, guttural and strange to Jedediah's ears, but their tone was not one of rage or accusation. It was something else, something Jedediah could not decipher. Another man detached himself from the silent line of warriors and walked to stand beside the chief. He was older, his face a web of deep wrinkles, and he spoke in heavily accented but clear English. "He is Kyle," the translator said, gesturing to the chief, leader of the Chiricahua. "And this," he gestured to the boy, who watched them with wide, serious eyes, "is his son, Nokona." Jedediah gave a slight stiff nod, his mouth too dry to form words. He had heard the name Kyle before, spoken in hushed, fearful tones by settlers in the nearest town, a name synonymous with fierce resistance and cunning strategy. He was standing before a legend. Kyle spoke again, his eyes locked on Jedediah's. The translator listened, then turned to Jedediah. "He says his son was tracking a pronghorn 2 days ago. His pony stumbled in a ravine, throwing him. The horse's hoof struck his leg before the animal bolted." The translator paused, letting the words sink in. Nokona was left alone, with a broken spirit and a wounded leg. He crawled for a day and a night, following this dry creek, his spirit preparing to journey to the next world. He collapsed on your land, ready to die. Kael's gaze was unwavering. It was not a question, but a statement of fact. Jedediah found his voice, a dry rasp. He was just a boy. He needed help. Kael's expression did not change, but he held up the hand clutching the bread. He opened his fingers, revealing the crust resting in his palm. He spoke again, a longer stream of the guttural language. The translator's voice followed. "My son says you found him. You carried him to your home. You used fire water and medicine from your woman to clean his wound and fight the poison. You gave him shelter. He says you had only this," the man gestured to the bread, "one piece of bread left in your world, and you broke it in two. You shared your last meal with an enemy." Jedediah swallowed hard. The word enemy hung in the air between them, a stark reminder of the chasm that separated their two peoples. "He wasn't my enemy," Jedediah said, his voice gaining a sliver of strength. "He was a child, hurt and thirsty. My wife, she taught me that a man's worth is measured by the kindness he shows to the helpless." A flicker of something surprise, respect, passed through Kael's stern eyes. He spoke a single, sharp phrase. "He asks the name of this woman with a strong spirit," the translator said. "Mary," Jedediah whispered, the name feeling like a sacred thing on his tongue. Kael gave a slow, deliberate nod, as if committing the name to memory. He then turned and surveyed Jedediah's desolate ranch once more. He saw the empty corral, the cracked water trough, the fields that had surrendered to dust. He saw the face of a man who had given away his last hope of survival to save the son of his enemy. Kael's gaze returned to Jedediah, and it was hard, resolute. He barked a series of commands to the translator, his voice echoing in the stillness. The translator turned to Jedediah, his expression one of gravity. Kale of the Chiricahua says you have given a great gift to his people. You have returned his only son. Such a gift creates a great debt. The Apache do not leave their debts unpaid. He says your land is dying. Your spirit is dying. You gave my chief's son life, so we will give life back to your home. Jedediah stared, uncomprehending. What do you mean? He stammered. Kale gave a sharp, commanding cry, and in an instant, the terrifying silent army exploded into a whirlwind of controlled, purposeful action. The riders broke their perfect formation. Dozens dismounted, handing their reins to others. Some produced axes and tools from their saddlebags. Others began to walk the perimeter of his land, their eyes on the ground, reading the earth like a book. A group of warriors headed directly for the sagging porch of his cabin, while another contingent marched towards the collapsed fence of the corral. They moved with a speed and efficiency that was breathtaking. Jedediah stood stunned, a statue in the midst of a maelstrom, as the Apache nation began to repay its debt. The air, once silent with menace, was now filled with the sounds of work, of shouted commands in a foreign tongue, and of the resurrection of a dying dream. The transformation of Jedediah's ranch was like witnessing a miracle in fast motion. What would have taken him a lifetime of backbreaking solitary labor to achieve, the Apache accomplished with the coordinated power of a force of nature. Jedediah stood near his cabin door, overwhelmed and useless, as Kale directed his people with sharp hand signals and brief, guttural commands. There was no wasted movement, no confusion. Every warrior had a purpose, moving with an innate understanding of his role within the whole. It was the same discipline and unity that made them such formidable warriors, now turned to the task of construction and renewal. A team of 12 men descended upon his dilapidated cabin. With axes that seemed like extensions of their own arms, they expertly stripped away the rotting timbers of the porch, replacing them with fresh, sturdy logs harvested from a stand of juniper in the foothills. Others swarmed over the roof, removing the old, cracked shingles and replacing them with new ones they split with practiced ease. They rechinked the walls with a mixture of mud and dried grass, sealing the gaps that had let in the wind and the dust for so long, making the cabin feel solid and secure for the first time in years. They worked not with sullen obligation, but with a vibrant energy, their low chants and rhythmic work sounds creating a symphony of reconstruction. Another group, led by an old man whose face was a map of the land itself, focused on the most critical problem: water. They ignored Jedediah's failed well. The old man walked the dry creek bed slowly, his eyes closed, holding a forked stick in his hands. He looked less like he was searching, and more like he was listening to a secret whispered by the earth. After nearly an hour, the stick in his hands twitched violently, dipping towards a spot that looked no different from any other patch of baked clay. The old man nodded, and at his signal, 12 warriors with sturdy, fire-hardened digging sticks fell upon the spot. They dug with a relentless rhythm, their powerful muscles gleaming with sweat under the hot sun. Jedediah watched in disbelief. He had dug 12 test holes himself, finding nothing but dust and rock, yet the Apache dug with an unshakable confidence. 5 feet down, then 10, then 15, the earth turned from dry dust to damp soil, then to dark, rich mud, and then a cheer went up. One of the diggers lifted his hands, dripping with water. They had found it, a hidden spring, a deep artery of life that Jedediah had never known existed. Meanwhile, Kale himself had taken a score of his best riders into the high plains. They disappeared over the ridge, a cloud of dust in their wake. Jedediah wondered where they had gone, his mind still struggling to process the unreality of the day. He was brought a bowl of stew by one of the women who had accompanied the war party, a rich, savory mix of rabbit, roots, and herbs that was the most delicious thing he had ever tasted. He sat on his new porch steps and ate, watching the whirlwind of activity. Nakona limped over and sat beside him, the boy's initial fear of him replaced by a quiet, solemn curiosity. They didn't speak, they had no shared words, but they sat together, sharing the space, a silent understanding passing between the broken man and the mending boy. By late afternoon, Kale and his riders returned. They were not alone. They were driving before them a herd of wild mustangs, a beautiful, chaotic mass of blacks, bays, and pintos. They expertly funneled the wild horses into the newly rebuilt corral, its fences now strong and tall. It took them less than an hour to separate a dozen of the finest mares and a proud, powerful stallion, releasing the rest back to the wild. Cale dismounted and walked over to Jedediah, the translator at his side. "This land needs horses," the translator relayed Cale's words. "These are yours. They are wild, but they have a strong spirit, like your Mary." The gift was so immense, so far beyond comprehension, that Jedediah could only stare, his eyes burning with unshed tears. He, who had lost everything, was now the owner of a fine herd. The work continued until sunset. The Apache warriors repaired his tools, sharpened his axe and plow blade, and even cleared the dead, brittle stalks from Mary's garden, turning over the soil to prepare it for a new planting. As dusk settled, a great fire was built in the center of the valley. The Apache gathered, and Jedediah was led to the place of honor beside Cale. They shared a meal, roasted deer and corn cakes, and for the first time since Mary's passing, the ranch was filled, not with silence and grief, but with the sounds of life, with laughter, and with the low, haunting melodies of Apache songs. Jedediah watched them, these men he had been taught to fear his entire life. He saw the way they cared for their children, the respect they showed their elders, the easy camaraderie between them. They were not the savages of the stories he'd been told. They were a people, proud and powerful, with a deep connection to the land and to each other. They had a code of honor that was as unyielding as the mountains they called home. A debt had been incurred, and it had been paid 100 times over. In a single day, they had not only rebuilt his ranch, they had rebuilt his hope. He looked at Cale, whose stern face was softened in the firelight, and at Nokona, who was laughing with his friends, his bandaged leg a mark of a journey that had somehow brought their two worlds together. Jedediah felt a profound sense of gratitude that went far beyond the new roof or the fresh well. They had saved his life, not from starvation, but from the far worse fate of utter despair. He had shared a crust of bread, and in return, they had given him back his world. He fell asleep that night by the fire, under a blanket of stars, the sounds of the Apache camp, a lullaby of renewal, feeling more at home than he had in a very long time. The sun rose on a new world. When Jedediah awoke, the Apache were already preparing to leave. The great fire had been reduced to a neat pile of ash, and there was almost no sign of the massive encampment from the night before. They moved with the same quiet efficiency with which they had worked, leaving the land as they had found it. Only the resurrected ranch stood as a testament to their presence. Cale, with Nokona at his side, approached Jedediah as he stood on his new porch, a steaming tin cup of coffee in his hand. The Apache had even left him supplies, sacks of corn, dried meat, beans, and coffee, enough to last him through the coming winter. "Our work is done," the translator said, speaking for Cale. "The debt is paid." Jedediah looked at the chief, at the strong, proud man who had shown him a form of grace he never knew existed. "What you have done here, paid is not a big enough word," Jedediah said, his voice thick with emotion. "You have given me more than a new ranch. You have given me a reason to live again." Cale listened to the translation, his dark eyes studying Jedediah's face. He then placed his hand over his own heart and extended it towards Jedediah, a gesture of profound respect and connection. Jedediah, understanding its meaning without needing words, mirrored the gesture. Nokona limped forward. In his hands, he held a small, intricately beaded leather pouch. He held it out to Jedediah. "For Mary's spirit," the translator explained, as Jedediah took the gift. "It is filled with sacred pollen, to bless her garden so that it will always grow." Jedediah clutched the small pouch, the soft leather cool against his palm. "Thank you," he whispered to the boy. Nokona looked up at him and, for the first time, a small smile touched his lips. It was a gesture that sealed the bond between them forever. Cale mounted his war pony, and with a final solemn nod to Jedediah, he turned and led his people away. Jedediah stood on his porch and watched them go, a great river of life flowing back towards the mountains, until the last rider disappeared over the horizon, leaving only a faint trail of dust hanging in the morning air. In the weeks and months that followed, Jedediah worked with a renewed vigor he hadn't felt in years. The silence of the ranch was no longer a suffocating blanket of grief, but a peaceful quiet filled with purpose. He drew clean, sweet water from the new well. He tamed the mustangs, his gentle hand and patient heart winning their trust. He planted Mary's garden with the seeds the Apache had given him, hardy strains of corn, squash, and beans that thrived in the arid soil. He sprinkled the sacred pollen Nokona had given him over the turned earth, a prayer to both his wife's memory and his new friends. And as if blessed, the garden flourished. The rains came, not in torrents, but in gentle, life-giving showers that seemed to fall only on his small patch of the world. His land, once a monochrome of brown and gray, was now stitched with the vibrant green of new life. He was no longer isolated. Once a season, Kael, Nokona, and a small trading party would descend from the mountains. They brought deer hides and blankets to trade for Jedediah's corn and the strong foals from his mustangs. They would share a meal and stories around his hearth. Jedediah learned a few words of their language, and Nokona, a quick study, learned more of his. The boy's leg healed, leaving only a faint scar, a permanent reminder of the event that had bridged their worlds. Jedediah became a trusted friend, a man known to the Chiricahua not as a settler or an encroacher, but as he who shares bread. He was a bridge between two peoples who so often met only in violence. One autumn evening, years later, Jedediah was sitting on his porch, watching the sun set behind the distant mountains. He was no longer the gaunt, haunted man he had been. His face was still weathered, but his eyes were clear and full of life. His ranch was a thriving oasis, a testament to an impossible act of grace. He held the small beaded pouch Nokona had given him, its leather now soft and worn from his touch. He thought of that desperate day when he had nothing left but a single loaf of bread and a heart full of despair. He had chosen kindness, not because he was a good man, but because in that moment he had nothing left to lose, and in doing so, he had gained everything. He had learned that a life is not measured by what you build for yourself, but by the bridges you build to others. He had learned that sometimes the greatest harvests grow from the smallest seeds of compassion, and that an act of kindness can echo through the canyons of time, bringing life back to the dust and making the desert bloom. The sun dipped below the horizon, and in the profound, peaceful silence of his valley, Jedediah smiled. He was home,